Welcome to Tribal Economic Development, a podcast highlighting best practices for creating, implementing, and sustaining plans that lead to success in Indian country. We are Waséyabek, an economic development firm dedicated to creating a sustainable path forward for the Nottawaseppi Huron Band of the Potawatomi. In our first 5 years of operation, we've grown from 0 revenue and 3 employees to nearly $100 million in revenue and a team of more than 500. Along the way, we've learned many valuable lessons. Here, we'll share those lessons with you. And now our hosts, Deirdre Mitchell, Waséyabek President and CEO, and Erica Weiss, Associate Attorney.
Hello and welcome back to Tribal Economic Development. We took a little hiatus. I'm sure you all probably noticed. Life happens sometimes, right? But we are excited to be back here to end 2024 off strong and to really push into 2025 strong too. I am Erica Weiss here with my co-host Deirdre Mitchell. Hi, Deirdre.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. Getting ready for the holidays, all that good stuff. So I'm Deirdre Mitchell. I'm the president and CEO of Waséyabek Development Company. And with us today, we have Bill Brooks, and he is our chief legal counsel for the company. Been with the Nottawaseppi tribe for about 17 years, and then officially with Waséyabek for about 2. But he's been with us the whole journey. Bill is the glue that holds us all together.
You don't often hear that about a lawyer, though, so that's good to hear.
That's true. That's what makes you special, Bill.
Absolutely. Well, Bill has certainly been around Indian country and Michigan for a long time. Bill, why don't you give us a little bit of your background?
Well, I've been in Michigan since 1989 and spent 5 years working with Michigan Indian Legal Services. And during that time, worked primarily on federal recognition, restoration efforts on behalf of a number of the tribes in the state. And out of that work evolved in-house counsel work for a number of tribes. And so I spent about 14 years in various capacities as general counsel for the Little River Band of Ottawa. I have done different project work for probably 6 of the tribes here in Michigan. And then as Deirdre had mentioned, for the last 17 years, have been general counsel, chief legal officer for the Nottawaseppi Huron Band of Potawatomi, doing everything from government work, gaming work, to more recently the economic development work.
Which makes you the perfect guest for our podcast today, because today we are talking about foundational documents. And considering you have worked with tribes for a very long time, I'm sure you've seen everything from constitutions to codes and ordinances and regulations. So we would like to just jump right into that today, if that sounds good to you. So we talked a lot about strategic planning in our previous podcast, which has been great and an awesome starting point. But in order to actually implement any of those strategic plans, you have to make sure your tribe has kind of that foundation to be able to even do any of those things. Yep. So let's start at square one. Talk to us a little bit about the Constitution and what a tribe needs in their Constitution to even be able to dive into non-gaming economic development.
I mean, I think the way that I look at it is you have to take every tribe where they're at in terms of what their goals are, what their capabilities are at a particular time. There's no one-size-fits-all for constitutions and that. But and oddly enough, the first work that I did for Nottawaseppi Tribal Council asked me to come down and look at their constitution and see if there were any legal impediments or things that were going to create problems that would impair their efforts to do economic diversification and that. And so you really need to look at who has the authority to do what, how the authority in the Constitution is allocated, and then making sure that the government can function in a way that can support economic development. And probably the particular things that I look at is, are there authorities to waive sovereign immunity, both by the tribe and is there any impediment to delegation of the right to waive sovereign immunity to an economic development entity? Is there clear authority to establish economic enterprises within the Constitution? And it doesn't necessarily have to be in there, but you want to make sure that there's nothing in the Constitution that would prohibit or call into question the authority of the tribal council to establish those things. The other thing that I often look at is what are the provisions dealing with tribal lands. And Nottawaseppi, for example, had a provision that even in the case of fee lands that the tribe might acquire, any sort of encumbrance or mortgage, even leasing of tribal lands would have required a vote of 80% of the membership, which would have been a very high bar and made it, pretty much any kind of economic development you have to acquire and you're using lands for that purpose. And if you want to be able to borrow against it, if you want to be able to lease it, all those sorts of things, that provision would have been a huge impediment in that. And so those are kind of the major structural things that I tend to look at. But then I also look at the Constitution from a what I would call a more pragmatic or practical side, and you have to have an understanding of how does that particular tribe operate in practice. What's the engagement of the tribal citizens? How do they interact with the institutions of tribal government? But I also forgot to mention that a number of tribes are organized such that most of the political power to make decisions rests with the entire tribal membership through a general council, and so that would be a huge one. That if any business decision requires a vote of the tribal membership, what are the quorum requirements? Does the Constitution allow the membership to delegate certain authority to an executive council or a business committee to do those things? So
I think that's a really important point, because you're not only looking at how does the government function and flow down to the EDC, but eventually you need people to make this happen. And if an executive comes in and asks to see those documents and looks at it and says, well, I have all the responsibility for making this happen, but I really have no ability to make decisions or guide the company, then you're not going to be able to attract good people. So that's another reason to do this.
Yeah, and ultimately, to be successful with economic development, it takes time, and the political institutions, both structurally and the way in which the tribal citizens interact with the government, you have to take that into account in terms of how you're structuring your organizational documents. Because if it doesn't fit the way that community works, it's not going to work. And so, you just have to be looking at those things carefully, and then engaging with the tribal leadership and the tribal community to make whatever changes, recognizing what their specific goals are within that tribal community.
And with you having said that, that really ties back to that strategic planning. So you can begin to see how all of this is really important to have in place, and everybody have a clear picture of how this is going to work, and then all of your documents support what it is you decided to do.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I was just building off that, definitely, we talked about from a timing aspect, right? If you're going to have to change something, heaven forbid you have to change something in your Constitution, right? No one likes having to go to membership to ask for a revision to your Constitution. But if you've taken the steps like we've talked about in doing your strategic planning and making sure that everybody is aligned as far as what those goals of the tribe are and how they want to achieve those goals, it makes it a little bit easier if you do go back and find some of those impediments in your Constitution. But to your point, that's not an overnight process by any means.
Yeah, and I have always been a huge proponent of good, carefully thought out and executed strategic planning, because your legal documents are not going to work if you don't have the buy-in from the stakeholders within that particular tribe, and that's where strategic planning gets that buy-in. The strategic planning will identify the specific goals and then guide what changes you need to make structurally in order to implement that particular plan.
And that's the really important period of time, too, that membership has the ability to provide direct input into what they want. Once that strategic plan is set and the organizational documents are set, you should then run on that unless you find an obvious reason to change something. But just to be clear, membership does have the ability to provide input at that strategic planning phase, and then different phases or different periods along the timeline.
Yep.
So let's talk about some of those structures. Now, we've got a constitution in place that we don't see any impediments to the economic development goals and strategies that your tribe wants to do. So what are kind of some of those? We mentioned structures. there are several ways that tribes can engage in economic development and economic diversification. Talk to us a little bit about some of those different structures.
The one that is probably most widely known across Indian country is the Section 17 Corporation. And Section 17 is a provision in the Indian Reorganization Act that was put in place in 1934, and it is the kind of corporate economic development parallel to the reorganized constitutional governments that the IRA contemplated. And a lot of tribes have used that particular structure because the Section 17 Corporation is the one that historically has always been recognized as having the same sovereign immunities and rights as a sovereign that the tribe itself has. So it is clearly exempt from federal taxes. It has the immunities of the tribe. And so a lot of tribes are pursuing economic development under Section 17 corporations, with varying degrees of success. I think the problem with that structure is that it is a charter that has to be approved by the Department of Interior. And so the process of getting that charter approved can be time-consuming. The Interior attorneys used to put in a lot of their opinions into what can go into a Section 17 charter. They have gotten better about that in recent years. But again, if you want to change that charter, you have to go back to the Interior Department. And so if you're using a Section 17 charter, you're probably using that as a holding company and then having authority within that charter to organize individual investments in businesses under that charter. And those might be structured in a variety of ways, under tribal law, state law, all sorts of things like that.
So what do we need to structure, let's say, an LLC under tribal law? What does that look like?
You first have to adopt a tribal limited liability company code. And there is what I think is a really great model that's out there. Lance Morgan developed a really nice template tribal LLC code that allows for organizing limited liability companies by any tribal member, but then also has specific articles within that code that are uniquely designed to wholly owned or majority-owned tribal LLCs. And the advantage of an LLC is that it's a recognized legal entity that businesses form under state laws around the country, and so banks and other people recognize that form. But the code template that Lance Morgan developed has these provisions that allow a tribe to essentially endow a tribally formed LLC with attributes of sovereign immunity. So they can kind of, again, protect the sovereign and manage the risk and how much exposure the sovereign is willing to expose itself in its business dealings. Nottawaseppi, we've adopted a variation of that particular code, and I think it's been pretty successful for Nottawaseppi.
You mentioned a very important distinction between Section 17 and an LLC, whether it's organized under a tribal ordinance or state law, if that's the way your tribe chooses to do it, is that the endowment of privileges and immunities of the tribe, right? Like you mentioned, the Section 17, it's kind of conferred on it, right?
Yep.
That's so from a sovereign immunity standpoint, there's not going to be that long drawn-out court case determining whether or not the tribe or the entity can even be sued before you even get into the merits of the case. Yep. Whereas a tribal LLC or a state LLC organized by a tribe or a tribal economic development, you've got that initial burden that you've got to worry about in any type of lawsuit is establishing that. And there's many, many cases that have tried to set forth factors in determining that. Depending on your case, your jurisdiction, your judge, that may be looked at differently. And so it's that's definitely one of those things to consider when you're thinking from a structural standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. The tribal law and then the organizing documents will include specific provisions that clarify that this is an arm of the tribe, is organized as a instrumentality of the tribe, and that strengthens the position of that company. The other thing that we've done at Nottawaseppi, for example, and at Waséyabek, is that we've been able to use the authorities that are in the tribal LLC code to kind of tailor the scope of the waiver of immunity that's in the organizing documents. And for example, most companies retain the right to apply Indian preference laws and retain their immunity from suits that they might be discriminating against non-tribal employees in order to execute or implement Indian preference in hiring. We also include language that waives immunity for things like tort claims, whether it's an auto accident, product liability, what have you. But it is specific to the assets of the company and then also to the insurance proceeds. And so you're not only using kind of general corporate structure to kind of shield the assets of the holding company and other affiliated companies that may be organized by Waséyabek, for example, but you're kind of reinforcing it with these limitations on the waiver that only specific assets are exposed.
Does your decision to set up as an LLC or some other type of organization then determine how you treat each one of the owned entities under the EDC, or does that get treated the same? I know with Waséyabek, we have kind of different legal structures for every company, every piece of real estate that we own.
I think the nuances that affect those decisions are really what is the company going to do, what space is it going to operate in, what are the financial and legal risks of operating within that particular business sector. And so you can tailor the specifics of the limited waiver to, again, protect the tribal investment in that company, but still allowing that company to operate within the commercial space without, customers and suppliers, et cetera, having to worry about whether they can enforce the contracts that the company's entering into.
So, Deidre, Bill and I as lawyers obviously deal with these words on pages all the time, right? Limited waivers, leases, mortgages, things like this. From an operational standpoint, how critical is it to be able to have the ability to waive sovereign immunity at the EDC level, the ability to incur indebtedness based on what those documents, Constitution, LLC code, operating documents at the LLC level? How crucial is that to be able to actually then run the business?
It's very crucial. I mean, you can do it when you need board approval or whatever, but that's just a time lag. So to be agile in business and responsive to your business partners or whatever the business case might be, it's super important to be able to do that. It's also when you're talking about acquiring debt or that kind of thing too, it's hard to plan what your broad strategy is if you don't know all of the levers that you have to pull. So if you say, well, I might be able to incur debt here, so I'm going to go pursue this project, but then at the last minute, the tribal council or some other deciding body says no, that really kind of sets you back in your relationships and your business advancement, all of it. So I think it's critically important. I think that's earned over time too. I don't think you should bring somebody in and just say, "Hey, here you go. You're in charge of it all."
Hand them the keys to the castle right off the gate.
And even though I do have the authority to do those things, the board is always informed before even we do it. So if there is some large objection for some reason, we can discuss it and we can work that out. So.
Yeah, and that's where and it comes down from the Constitution is making sure that there is clear legal authority to delegate the authority or to do limited waivers down the line. And that, for example, in the NHPP LLC code, there is authority to do it. The council is the only one that can approve whatever that is in the Waséyabek organizational documents, but then the council has then delegated authority to the Waséyabek board to delegate further down, which they have. And as Deidre mentioned, it's a process of earning trust. And at Waséyabek, for example, there were a number of things that always had to go back to the board for approval. But as the board and the council have gotten confidence in the decision-making process and the controls that are put in place throughout the organization, they have delegated that authority down the chain. And so the operating manager who's trying to run each particular operating company has the ability to do what they need to run those companies. But that was a process that we had to go through.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note is that while we're talking about these foundational documents in the sense of making sure that they delegate certain authority to be able to do things, they're also meant to put limitations, right? There are limitations contained in each of those documents related to certain thresholds that the board needs to see things at X amount the tribal council needs to see these particular topics when they come up and need decisions made on them. So not only are these foundational documents used as kind of the sword to help you with your economic development, they're also used as a shield, too, to make sure that the tribe is still protected in whatever you're out there doing.
Yeah, and one of the things that flows, again, it flows down from the Constitution, is that there are specific requirements that have to be met for any waiver to be effective. It has to be limited in time. It has to be limited in who are the parties that benefit from that waiver that can bring a claim pursuant to that waiver. It has to limit any recourse to the assets of that particular company, and that recourse can be further limited in the contract in terms of limitation on damages provisions, things like that. And I think one of the controls that we built in is that any agreement that whether it's Waséyabek or any of the other subsidiary companies, if it includes a waiver of immunity, that those terms have to be reviewed by legal counsel. So legal counsel can confirm that the form of that limited waiver complies with all the legal requirements running down from the Constitution through the organizational documents for the company.
Erica, I think it's important to note, too, that element of control, that we always want to make sure that the tribe is in control of these companies. So going back to, is the minority owner the one that's actually controlling these major decisions? So that operating agreement in your documents give those points that clearly demonstrate that the tribe retains control of these companies.
Yeah, a great point, Deidre, great point. And you brought up operating agreement. We've talked about Constitution, we've talked about tribal law, if you decide to create an LLC code or a corporate code. But then we obviously get down to, like you said, we've kind of flowed down, right? Yep. So that next thing is the operating agreement for the economic development company, which, as we've been talking about, has some of those delegations of authorities, those limitations, those, hey, we're allowing them to be cloaked in the privileges and immunities of the tribe. What are kind of some of the foundational provisions that should be included in an operating agreement for an EDC?
Before we jump to that, I do want to make one other point about the law under which you organize. Is that, to my mind, a lot of tribes organize under state laws, but something that I think folks will need to factor in now is that the U.S. Treasury Department, has a notice of proposed rulemaking. And that they are beginning to address when they will recognize business entities organized by tribes as being the same as the tribe for federal tax purposes. And the scope that is currently proposed only extends to business entities that are wholly owned by the tribe and that are organized under tribal law. And so that I mean, I probably would have been more willing to consider state LLC codes or other state laws in the past, but I think because of that, from a protective standpoint, would probably lean and advise towards using tribal laws now from now on out until the Treasury Department clarifies that and expands that beyond tribally organized entities.
And one other point you've made in discussions before is if you're considering going into federal contracting, that Section 17 might not be your best choice if that's your main kind of pursuit. You
probably would never have a Section 17 corporation proper as a federal contractor, but if the Section 17 charter allows that entity to form LLCs or some other form of company under that as an operating company, that particular company.
I see.
Yeah, because the federal contracting world requires that entity to waive its immunity, particularly as to contract claims, because when you're doing work for the federal government doesn't want to have claims from suppliers and subcontractors that they haven't been paid, and not being able to have a place to go. That those individuals need to be able to enforce those contracts.
Yep. Side note, Bill is not offering any form of legal advice, and if you'd like to expand on anything he said here, please consult your legal counsel. Operating agreements. Talk to us about operating agreements, Bill.
Your operating agreements, for your individual companies are their organic documents that they operate under, and so it depends on under what law they're being formed, what the formation requirements are. But the other factor is what is the purpose of the particular company that's being organized? Where is it can operate? Because you would probably organize things differently if it's a company that is being organized to operate primarily or exclusively on reservation lands, as opposed to a company that's going to be operating off reservation, a company that's going to be engaging or pursuing federal contracts, and that. And so that's kind of the big picture. The specifics are, and again, this is something that I think we've learned through experience, is that we have evolved the clarity with which and the substance of our organizational documents to more clearly define who has the authority to do what. And the goal is to make sure that the things that require more nimble, quick decisions by the folks who are running the companies on a day-to-day basis, that they have that authority to do those things. But that isn't. I think Deidre made the point earlier that there are controls up the chain on kind of the major policy decisions, and that there's reporting, transparency, those sorts of things.
I think it's important to note that an operating document should be somewhat a living document too, because we've gone through, I think, 5 revisions since I've started.
We're on 6.
Is it? Okay, we're on 6. And that has to do with the point earlier of gaining trust over time in the processes, decision-making, that kind of thing. But also things that just didn't work, that we thought sounded logical in the first draft, but just didn't work. And so as we've gotten bigger and more complex, that document, the essence of it stays the same, but there are pieces of it that change and evolve over time.
Yeah, I think experience. You find things that you can't get done because the document doesn't allow you to get it done, and so it's a process of educating the stakeholders you need to up the chain, and getting authority to getting authority kind of run down to the people who need to make those decisions.
So one thing that I think, or one major point in your operating agreement that is going to be directly impacted by your constitution and or tribal code, if that's what you're organizing under, is going to be how the main economic development vehicle, right? So likely in most cases, a holding company, how it's managed, and whether that is a board and what that board makeup looks like, and what authority they can delegate for, to executive level managers and things of that nature. Talk to us a little bit about, you've worked with a number of tribes. I don't want to know specifics, but what are the different structures from kind of a board or management level standpoint have you seen?
It's really all over the map, and in some tribes, the tribal council also serves as the board of their EDC. In other tribes, it's a mix, and then in some tribes, it's a completely independent group. Again, it's all over the map. My personal view is it is better to ensure that you need to have accountability and reporting to the tribal leadership and the tribal stakeholders, but it is better to separate business decision making from politics. And the best way to do that is have a board that is made up of individuals who have experience in the business world, and whose responsibility, as it is defined in the organizational documents, is to make decisions based on what is best for the business to accomplish the business goals, however those are defined in your organizational documents, to keep that focus there. And that, because politics can be fickle. Some tribes have elections where every council seat is up every 2 years. And again, business requires some consistency, stability to be successful. That doesn't mean there can be a change in your business goals, but the business operations do need that stability to operate. I mean, the one thing that I would recommend is that every tribe consider having at least one, if not more, independent board members who have no political stake within the tribal political community, and that at least having a voice that is there strictly for what's best for the business, what's going to make those businesses successful.
I think that's something Nottawaseppi has done particularly well. I mean, they articulated early to the board, we want you to make good business decisions. We will worry about, as a tribal council, if there's any political overlay that needs to happen. But that's, again, if going back to hiring good people to run your EDCs, if you don't have that clear hierarchy established, it's really hard to get anything done because I wouldn't take a job where I knew every 2 years the idea of what we're doing for business is going to change because there's just very little opportunity for success.
Yep.
And so any consistency, long-term stability, staying with the plan that you can offer her is really, really important. I think Nottawaseppi's done a really good job of that.
Yeah, and again, I think that gets back to the strategic planning piece. And what Nottawaseppi has done is they've implemented 5-year planning cycles, which go beyond the 4-year terms of office for elected officials. And it has provided a good buffer against the political winds.
And having staggered terms on the board, too, that helps that you don't get a whole new idea every couple of years. So I think that's been really important.
At both the board level and the tribal council level.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
So you're never in a position where not only is tribal leadership completely overturned, but your entire business leadership board is also overturned as well, which is helpful.
And to Bill's point, having those one or more independent board members has been really helpful for us. Ours both happen to have a heavy financial background, so that's been really helpful. And to the point that you can integrate them into, we do business a little differently in Indian country. It isn't just a numbers game, but then to have that perspective when you're having the conversations, I think is super helpful.
Yep.
Definitely. So other things to keep in mind with the operating agreement, we've already talked a little bit about how sovereign immunity can be waived and how those provisions should be. And those, again, provisions might change based on the landscape within which you're operating, right? Our operating agreements look a little different for purely real estate investments than they do, for example, one of our manufacturing companies maybe, right? And that's just a difference or our federal contractors. They're certainly things that need to be in the operating agreement for a federal contracting vehicle per federal regulations that are not needed for just a regular real estate or manufacturing company.
Correct, yeah.
So there are definitely differences there depending on what space you're operating in and what laws you're organized under. So once we've got those kind of foundational operating documents, the operating agreement, articles of organization, which we didn't really talk about too much, but a lot of that is an overlap or can be an overlap with that operating agreement. Let's take it one step further into the company with policies and procedures, which I know we've had on our list for a really long time to get updated at Waséyabek. But how important are policies and procedures in implementing economic diversification?
They're important because they're the bridge between the organizational documents and the day-to-day operations of the company. Probably the one that I think has been most important and most critical at Waséyabek, and it's also addressed in the operating agreement, which is the reporting. So there is a regular cadence of reporting to the key stakeholders, and so with Deidre, for example, we used to have monthly board meetings. We're now doing quarterly board meetings, but then there's a regular cadence of reporting financial results and a number of other metrics to the board. And then likewise, there is quarterly reporting to the tribal council, who under the Waséyabek documents acts on behalf of the owner of the tribe, in holding the board and management accountable for executing on its plans. And then it's not part of the operating agreement, but it's built into the communication policy, which is regular reporting to the tribal membership. And that because I can't overemphasize that kind of maintaining that flow of information is essential to maintaining stakeholder support and buy-in, which is absolutely critical for long-term economic development success.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. That's been really critical all the way through our development. And I would say those policies change a bit too, because when we were in our foundation building stage and we were kind of a startup and things were all over the place, those policies might look a little different than when we get more mature. So just reviewing those, we have a governance committee, a finance and audit committee, and a compensation committee. So the governance committee reviews all of those periodically to say, is it keeping up with where we're at in the company's development? Two other ones that I think are important are the dividend policy and then the capital preservation policy, because that's really where it sets out for everyone to understand when would we be paying a dividend? How are we going to retain capital in the companies for operating capital and those kinds of things? So they're all agreed on, laid out, and nobody then has confusion about what that's supposed to look like.
The one that I would add to your list is early on we develop a due diligence process policy, and that's one that probably needs to be updated. But that policy and process was put in place so it was clear to the board and probably more important to the tribal council. This is what is going to be looked at anytime there's an investment, whether it's a real estate investment or an operating company that we're looking at acquiring. And walking through the key stakeholders as to how we're doing that, they can see the results of that due diligence. That process, really went a long way towards building the confidence in the political stakeholders that management is doing its due diligence to make careful decisions about investing tribal resources. And as a result of that, having gone through a number of transactions with the board and tribal council, the tribal council essentially said, "We trust you that you're going to do this. This is, extremely thorough, comprehensive. You're not only thinking about is this a smart investment, but how are you going to manage it and integrate that company into your operations to make sure its success continues after we acquire it." That confidence, then the tribal council, essentially freed up management and the board to do things without having to go back to council for many decisions. Really, it's just a reporting function now, and then the tribal council approving the annual strategic plan, the 5-year plans, then the appropriation of revenue allocation funds to Waséyabek. And so that policy was absolutely critical to helping Waséyabek get to where it's at now.
Yeah, that's a good point, because that was the first one, really, that we did, and that really set the tone and helped us organize around our mission and how exactly we were going to do it. So you're right, that was a really, really important early document that we all had to align around.
Yeah, and Bill, I'm glad you brought up, at the end of the day, the things that ultimately go back to tribal council are kind of that overarching 5-year strategic plan, how revenue allocation planning is done. We do, Deidre, you mentioned, have the governance committee, which is made up of board members who are selected by the tribal council in order to serve on that board. And so going back to Deidre's point, at the end of the day, yes, the Constitution, the tribal laws, the operating agreements, the foundational policies are there to help us and allow us the authority to run those businesses. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the tribe is the one running these businesses, and the tribe has the final say. And this is where we want our economic diversification to go and how we want you to go about doing it. And again, and certainly a credit to Deidre and Bill both. You guys have done a fabulous job of building that trust with not only the tribal council and the board, but also tribal membership in order to get us where we are today. And I think if we could give anything to our listeners, it would be those foundational things, but time and transparency are really the biggest things, right?
Agreed.
So, any closing comments, Bill?
No, it's been a fun journey, and I always tell people that I love the fact that the tribes and the tribal leaders that I've worked for have let me do some really cool stuff, and kind of the investment approach that Nottawaseppi is taking, I think, is pretty unique amongst Indian country because of its diversification, and the tribe has really taken kind of a long-term view. But again, that was a Nottawaseppi decision, and that's why, even though we're here talking about legal documents primarily, I still always say that a good strategic plan is the best foundation you can start with.
I would say we have our legal counsel here today, that it's really important that legal counsel understands the mission of the company. And Bill, you're having business experience prior to getting here and working with other tribes has just been really invaluable, because the legal support is there to keep us out of trouble, but also to support us as we go forward in doing what we're doing. And if there's not even alignment between those two parties, that can be really prohibitive. So,
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all for tuning in with us today and listening. If you enjoy Tribal Economic Development Podcast, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Additionally, if you have any questions for us or any topics that you're dying to hear more about, please visit waséyabek.com/podcasts and leave us a comment using our feedback form. You'll hear from us in 2025.